Hello and welcome to another Healthy Bite. This week we are celebrating the 90th birthday of Allan Savory. Now, Allan Savory is a thought leader in the world of holistic management. In fact, he wrote the textbook on holistic management, and he has inspired literally millions of people and mentored hundreds of thousands of farmers and practitioners around the world into holistic management of the land in particular, but holistic management in general. And I was first introduced to Allan about 20 years ago. My co-founders of Nourishing Australia, Vicky and Tim Poulter, introduced me to holistic land management. And as a holistic practitioner, health practitioner for over 40 years, it was a really inspiring connection to realize that, hey, holistic is not some new age philosophy. It just happens to be the way the human body works, which I always knew, but it also happens to be the way the planet works, which I also suspected. And that message that Allan Savory shares and has been teaching for over 50 or more years, has really is more important today than ever before. I mean, we hear so much about climate change. It's almost exclusively focused on fossil fuels, and the answer is so much more complicated and accessible than that. Animals are demonized. This is part of the narrative. And in fact, as Allan Savory says, don't blame the resource, blame the way the resource is managed. And the way the resource is managed when it comes to animals is an important lesson for us all. Look, one of the really important messages that Allan shares is to mimic nature. And when you look at the plains of the Serengeti, the grasslands of the Serengeti, there were always, and there have been always, huge herds of herbivores pushing through the land. They will go through in their hundreds of thousands sometimes, if not more, and they will eat the grass, they will urinate, they will defecate, they will trample the soil, and then they'll move on, and they won't return to that grassland for another year. And in that time, it has an opportunity to regenerate. And this is the way of using animals to literally improve and regenerate soil. It takes nature on its own about 500 years to grow 1 inch of soil. But in a well-managed livestock farm, a regenerative farm, you can grow 1 inch of nutrient-dense soil in 3 to 5 years and sequester carbon in the process. So mimicking nature is an important part of Allan Savory's message. So rather than setting stock out on a huge paddock and letting them wander around, seemingly doing what they like, it's better to keep them in tight packs. And some of the clips I'm going to be sharing with you in this video, in this podcast, demonstrate the benefits of doing just that. We have had a relationship with animals throughout our entire evolutionary journey. I mean, without animal nutrition, without animal, or the product of animals, we would still be, I would suspect, a bit like chimpanzees and gorillas, from which we split up some 6 million years ago. Now, interestingly, the brain size of chimps and gorillas hasn't changed in 6 million years. It's around 500 cc's or 450 cc's. And when we got up on 2 legs as Australopithecus, something happened. Things changed. And as we moved through our evolutionary journey from Homo habilis, Homo erectus, Neanderthals, and then on to Homo sapiens, our brain sizes increased to 1500 cc's. Actually, sadly, it's gone back down again, but that's to do with nutrition. And a nutrient-dense diet is important to include animals in that process. And rather than demonizing animals, which I must say, I agree with those that say industrial animal agriculture, feedlots, caged hens, caged pigs. What is bad for the animal is bad for us as humans, and it's bad for the planet. But the converse is true as well. What is good for the animal is good for the food supply, to better food supply, and it's good for the planet as well. So it's a win-win-win. And this is something that Allan Savory has championed. And I'm going to share now his TEDx talk has had over 6 million views, and it really should be viewed by hundreds of millions. And I'm going to give you a little excerpt here which shows the difference in land, in the quality of the land, in the preservation of the soil. It takes soil. Now, soil is such an important part of our lives. I mean, literally, our food is grown in soils. It's not grown in labs or in hydroponics. I mean, it is, but it is far more nutrient dense if we have healthy soils in which to grow our food in. And I mentioned Nourishing Australia. I mean, Nourishing Australia is a not-for-profit organisation, and the conference that is occurring at Sydney University, at University of Technology Sydney on the 1st of November 2025, is also being streamed globally and will be available long after that date. So if you're looking at this podcast before the 1st of November, I'd encourage you to join us live and at the UTS in Sydney. But if you can't make it, I would encourage you to go online and register online. We will have the QR code, which is on the screen right now. So I would encourage you to join us. But the message is an important one, and so much of it is inspired by Allan Savory, who, as I say, is celebrating his 90th birthday this week. So this short excerpt from the TEDx talk shows land transformation utilizing the resource of animals in a way that is enabling nature, not trying to domineer or overpower nature, but enabling nature. So have a look at this.
It has just come through 4 months of very good rains it got that year, and it's going into the long dry season. But as you can see, all of that rain, almost all of it, has evaporated from the soil surface. Their river is dry despite the rain just having ended, okay, and we have 150,000 people on almost permanent food aid. Now let's go to our land nearby on the same day with the same rainfall, and look at that. Our river is flowing and healthy and clean. It's fine. The production of grass, shrubs, trees, wildlife, everything is now more productive, and we have virtually no fear of dry years. And we did that by increasing the cattle and goats 400%, planning the grazing to mimic nature and integrate them with all the elephants, buffalo, giraffe, and other animals that we have. But before we began, our land looked like that. This site was bare and eroding for over 30 years, regardless of what rain we got. Okay? Watch the marked tree and see the change as we use livestock to mimic nature. This was another site where it had been bare and eroding, and at the base of the marked small tree, we had lost over 30 centimeters of soil. Okay? And again, watch the change just using livestock to mimic nature. And there are fallen trees in that now, because these are now, the better land is now attracting elephants, etc. This land in Mexico was in terrible condition, and I've had to mark the hill because the change is so profound. I began helping a family in the Karoo Desert in the 1970s, turn the desert that you see on the right there back to grassland, and thankfully now their grandchildren are on the land with hope for the future. And look at the amazing change in this one, where that gully has completely healed using nothing but livestock mimicking nature. And once more, we have the third generation of that family on that land with their flag still flying.
Now, this week we'll also be re-releasing the podcast that I did with Allan Savory some 6 years ago, and it is an audio-only file, but hey, listen, I think most people are listening to the podcast on audio, and if you're watching this on YouTube, then just enjoy a photo of the man celebrating his 90th birthday. Now, there were many things that Allan Savory has inspired me with. One of the most important things he said to me was that if we are expecting the change to come from above, and by that, he was not talking about God, he was talking about governments or organizations that are big, whether they're medical associations, government regulatory bodies, governments, government departments. If we're waiting for the change to come from above, we will be waiting a long time. Why? Because those organizations are very slow to take on new information. There are many egos and reputations that are involved in changing a position at that level. And also, sadly, too often, organizations like that simply lack common sense. The change has to come literally and metaphorically from the ground up, from you and me, and from the ground on which we stand, on the ground on which we grow our food. So if we're waiting for the change to come from above, we'll be waiting a long time. The change has to come from you and me, which is again why Nourishing Australia are running this conference in an urban environment in the middle of Sydney. Now, the other thing that Allan Savory said, and he says so much that's important, is that organizations need to have a holistic context, something that sits over the top of every decision that is made. Now, sadly, for the last 40 or 50 years, as we live in a market-driven economy where the shareholder reigns supreme, where things have been privatized, where credit is available so that you and I can buy shares in things we once all owned. In Australia, we used to all own the banks. We used to all own the local utilities like gas and water and electricity and telephone and etc. And in the interests of efficiency, apparently everything was privatized. And then as we were offered credit to go and buy shares in what we once always owned. Now, in my opinion, that is an example of economic irrationalism, but the last 40 years or 50 years we have been living through a time of economic rationalism, a market-driven economy. Let the markets dictate. And the holistic context that sits over almost every decision that is made at almost every level is one about productivity and profit. If we can show an increase in productivity, if we can show an increase in profit, then everything else is fine. And for that reason, health and environmental costs have been externalized. They're never built into seemingly cheap food or seemingly cheap clothes. If there are any health costs that arise because of those seemingly cheap foods that line our supermarket shelves, or seemingly cheap clothes, or the toxic chemicals that there are now ubiquitous in our environment, plastics, forever chemicals. There are over 100,000 chemicals. All of this industry that has been developed over the last 40 or 50 years, all of the health costs and environmental costs are externalized to you and me. Either we live through them permanently, or we have to survive them, or our governments then have to pay for the health costs and the cleanup costs that go with it. But if we put the true value of health and environment into how things were produced, that would be a holistic context. So to bring back to one of Allan Savory's important messages about holistic context, a good example of a holistic context is to say it's fine to make money, there is no problem with making money, but whatever is produced or sold must be good for human health and for the health of the planet. So if you have a product or a service that you want to sell, great, but you have to show that it is good for human health, that's both physical and mental, which puts the whole internet and social media into a different context, the seemingly free access we have to those things. looking at the mental health issues that are going on as a result of it is another example. So if you have a product or a service that you are selling, the holistic context that it should have is that it should be good for human health and planetary health, and then go off and make as big a product as you want. And if it is good for human or planetary health, then you might get some bonuses, some subsidies. If it's neutral, well, that's okay. But if it damages human or planetary health, then that product should be much more expensive, and the costs for dealing with those issues should be built in. So these are just some of the examples that have inspired so many people around the world, and Allan Savory's message is more important today than it ever was. His story is an important one and an interesting one. He started in the national parks of Rhodesia or Zimbabwe, as it then became, and he was involved in massive culling of elephants 40 or 50 years ago, to his great regret. But he has turned that around into something incredibly positive with a really important story. So I would encourage you to join us on the Nourishing Australia conference on the 1st of November in Sydney, or online anywhere in the world. And I will leave you with this last section of the TEDx talk from Allan Savory.
The man in the middle is an Argentinian researcher, and he has documented the steady decline of that land over the years as they kept reducing the sheep numbers. They put 25,000 sheep in one flock, really mimicking nature now, with planned grazing, okay, and they have documented a 50% increase in the production of the land in the first year. We now have in the violent Horn of Africa pastoralists planning their grazing to mimic nature and openly saying it is the only hope they have of saving their families and saving their culture. 95% of that land can only feed people from animals. I remind you that I am talking about most of the world's land here that controls our fate, including the most violent region of the world where only animals can feed people from about 95% of the land. What we are doing globally is causing climate change as much as, I believe, fossil fuels, and maybe more than fossil fuels. But worse than that, it is causing hunger, poverty, violence, social breakdown, and war. And as I am talking to you, millions of men, women, and children are suffering and dying. And if this continues, we are unlikely to be able to stop the climate changing even after we have eliminated the use of fossil fuels. I believe I've shown you how we can work with nature at very low cost to reverse all this. We are already doing so on about 15 million hectares on 5 continents. And people who understand far more about carbon than I do calculate that for illustrative purposes, if we do what I am showing you here, we can take enough carbon out of the atmosphere and safely store it in the grassland soils for thousands of years. And if we just do that on about half the world's grasslands that I've shown you, we can take us back to pre-industrial levels while feeding people. I can think of almost nothing that offers more hope for our planet, for your children, and their children, and all of humanity.
So I'd encourage you to join us at the Unstress, at the Nourishing Australia conference, and use the promo code UnstressHealth20 to get 20% off the registration fee. The QR code is on the screen. The promo code UnstressHealth20 will give you a 20% off the registration fee. And I'll look forward to seeing you in person there or online. Until then, this is Dr. Ron Ehrlich. Be well.
This podcast provides general information and discussion about medicine, health and related subjects. For content is not intended and should not be construed as medical advice or as a substitute for care by a qualified medical practitioner. If you or any other person has a medical concern, he or she should consult with an appropriately qualified medical practitioner. Guests who speak in this podcast express their own opinions, experiences, and conclusions.